The men who served under Caleb Vance had witnessed him orchestrate acts of cold, calculated brutality that would break lesser individuals. They had stood by in absolute silence while he fractured a card shark's fingers over a high-stakes table, his voice never rising above a conversational murmur. They had flanked him in underground concrete vaults while he dismantled multi-million-dollar syndicates with nothing but a three-sentence phone call and a razor-thin stare. Not one of those hardened alphas had ever flinched. Not one had ever questioned the absolute ironclad authority of the man who ruled everything south of the Seattle Canal. But on a bitter Friday morning in December, when the young Omega curled into a tight, defensive ball on the worn leather sofa in the back office, pulled Caleb's heavy black leather jacket off the desk chair, pressed the cedar-soaked collar deep against his scent gland, and systematically tucked the heavy material around himself in a frantic nest built entirely from pure, raw instinct, every single one of those ruthless men looked away. It wasn't out of fear, it was something closer to profound reverence, a collective, breathless shock. Because Caleb Vance had never, in his entire lethal life, permitted another human being to touch that jacket. It was his second skin, saturated with the dominant pheromones of an alpha who answered to no one. And the boy sleeping in the back office, the quiet, fragile baker who had arrived in the city like a ghost, didn't even realize what his body had done. He didn't know he had just claimed the city's most dangerous predator as his home. The Omega's name was Emerson Voss, and 3 months before he buried his face in that leather jacket, he hadn't even known Caleb Vance existed. 3 months before that quiet room, before the rich scent of dark coffee grounds, cold steel, and burning cedar smoke had settled into his bones, Emerson had been running so hard, for so long, that his mind had begun to splinter. He had forgotten to eat for days at a time. He had slept upright in dark subterranean bus terminals with his hood pulled low over his eyes and his inner scent locked down so violently behind heavy layers of synthetic chemical blockers that his own neck glands burned from the toxic effort. To truly understand how a boy who trusted no one ended up nesting in the armor of a crime lord, you have to go back to the absolute beginning. You have to go back to a dying town called Bridger, tucked away into the harsh, forgotten expanse of eastern Montana, where the wheat ran gold to the flat horizon and the money had run out a generation ago. Emerson had been born into a family that existed in a state of perpetual, generational siege. They were always exactly one bad harvest away from complete structural collapse. His father, Leon Voss, was a beta whose hands were permanently stained with topsoil and machine grease. He farmed a stretch of land that was 3 generations old and 2 generations past its prime earning years. Leon was a man molded by winters that could freeze a tractor engine solid overnight, hollow-cheeked, silent, and bent by the sheer weight of interest rates. His mother, Anne, was a soft-spoken Omega who had married Leon out of a desperate mixture of youthful love and severely limited geographic options. She had made her peace with the harsh reality of the plains before Emerson could even walk. They were decent people. Not warm, not cold, just decent in the tragic manner of those whose basic survival takes up all the available space where tenderness might otherwise live. Then at 14, Emerson presented. In the Midwestern agricultural corridors, presentation wasn't a biological milestone. It was an economic verdict. When the scent of wild honey and wet river stone finally broke through Emerson's skin, his mother hadn't celebrated. She had sat at the scratched Formica kitchen table and wept. Her tears didn't stem from shame, but from a terrifying prophetic recognition. Anne knew exactly what happened to rural Omegas who possessed no family money, no powerful name, and no alpha lineage to shield them from the predatory nature of the territory. She had lived that exact vulnerability. She had married her way into beta safety to escape the brutal whims of local alpha packs, spending 20 long years pretending that basic physical safety was the same thing as happiness. Now her son stood in the kitchen doorway, smelling of high summer and deep water, and the very same grim arithmetic that had governed her life was already reaching out its cold, invisible fingers for his throat. The ruin of the Voss family arrived in the late autumn, wearing the expensive visual language of a man named Soren Aldrich. Aldrich ran the predatory lending operations that kept half the independent farming families in the eastern corridor alive between the spring planting and the fall harvest. It was one of those slick corporate outfits that called itself an agricultural cooperative on paper, but functioned in reality exactly how a slow-jawed animal trap works, completely patient, utterly invisible, right up until the steel teeth snap shut on a leg. Leon Voss had borrowed against 3 successive seasons of wheat to fix a broken combine and pay off a medical debt. The wheat had come in short 2 years running, scorched by drought. By the 3rd year, the compounding interest on the debt had completely outgrown the land's physical capacity to pay it back. Aldrich came to the house on a bleak Tuesday in October. The sky was the color of zinc. He sat in their small, modest kitchen, drank the weak coffee Anne poured for him, and laid out the foreclosure terms with the calm, casual comfort of a businessman who had broken dozens of families before and found the process highly lucrative. The debt was being called in full. The 3-generation farm was forfeit. Unless. There was always Anne, unless with alphas like Soren Aldrich. The unless was Emerson. Aldrich had a powerful business partner in Billings, an alpha named Garrett Vance. Garrett ran the primary commercial distribution networks for the entire agricultural corridor, a man with excessive political leverage and an appetite for traditional structures. Garrett needed what Aldrich referred to, with a polished smile that never reached his dead eyes, as an omega of good stock. A clean, young, unbonded boy from the valley to anchor his estate and bear his children. Good stock. Emerson stood paralyzed in the dark, narrow hallway outside the kitchen, listening through the crack in the door. The phrase cut through him like a winter frost, cold, clean, and utterly dehumanizing. Good stock. The clinical language of livestock auctions applied to him in his own mother's kitchen, while the scent of fresh coffee still hung in the air. His parents didn't say yes that night, but they didn't say no either. They simply lacked the leverage for a refusal. That night, Emerson lay rigid in his small bedroom, listening through the thin, uninsulated walls to the muted sounds of his parents' despair. His mother's voice was low, fast, and frantic, the sound of an omega trying to bargain with fate. His father's response was even lower, flat, and broken, the tone of a man whose spirit had been ground down into the dust of his own fields. It was a conversation entirely shaped by a decision that the mathematics of poverty had already finalized. Leon came into Emerson's room the following morning at dawn. He sat heavily on the edge of the mattress, his work boots caked in dry mud, staring out the window for a long time without making eye contact. "I won't force you, son," Leon said, his voice raspy. When he finally turned his head, his eyes were bloodshot and rimmed with red. "But if I can't save this acreage, your mother and I have nothing left. We'll be off the land by winter. I know exactly what I'm asking you to give up." Emerson looked at his father, at the deep, weathered creases around the man's eyes, at the calluses on hands that had worked 12 hours a day, every day of his life, only to end up right here, offering his only child to a wealthy stranger in exchange for a few hundred acres of dying dirt. "How long do I have?" Emerson asked softly. Leon's shoulders dropped 3 inches, the posture of total surrender. "A month. The formal bonding ritual is scheduled for the first week of November." Emerson simply nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice, and he didn't shed a single tear. He merely stood up, walked out past the barn into the overgrown brush at the edge of the property, and sat in the freezing grass. He placed his bare palm over the sensitive scent gland at the base of his neck, feeling the warmth of the honey and wet stone pulsing beneath his skin, and thought with absolute, crystalline clarity, "I will not do this. I love you both. But I would rather die in the cold than let that man buy my blood." He left the farm on a Thursday night, 2 weeks before the scheduled ritual. His entire life was reduced to a single canvas backpack, 3 changes of clothes, a toothbrush, $300 in crumpled cash he had painstakingly saved from selling roadside eggs, and a small, faded photograph of his mother standing in the middle of the wheat field during the good year. The legendary season a decade ago, when the rain had fallen perfectly, the yield had broken records, and she had been caught mid-law, looking beautiful and radiant. He left a short note on the kitchen island. "I love you. I'm so sorry. Don't look for me. I'll be all right." That final sentence was a massive lie, but a son who was about to shatter his parents' lives to save his own autonomy was allowed at least one kind lie on his way out the door. He hitched a ride with a passing grain truck to the small Greyhound terminal in Miles City and bought a one-way ticket to the furthest destination his cash could secure that wasn't Montana. Portland, Oregon. That was how Emerson Voss, 23 years old, entirely broke, physically terrified, and smelling faintly of synthetic chemicals meant to suppress the honeyed warmth of his heritage, ended up sleeping on a wooden bench outside a transit station where he knew absolutely no one. Portland lasted exactly 9 days. Emerson managed to find an under-the-table cash job, washing heavy grease pans in the back of a cramped noodle shop in the Pearl District. He slept in a chaotic downtown night shelter for 3 nights until his boots were stolen, then transitioned to sleeping on a pile of flattened cardboard boxes in the back of the restaurant's storage room. The owner, a tired, overworked beta named Greta, had taken pity on the silent boy with the shadowed eyes. She told him he could use the space as long as the floors were mopped completely clean before the morning opening crew arrived. It wasn't living, it was survival, raw and mechanical. And then, on the 9th afternoon, the fragile piece shattered. Emerson was dragging a heavy bag of trash to the alley dumpster when he spotted a black sedan idling at the corner. Stepping out of the passenger side was a heavy-set alpha named Pokey, a brute who worked directly as Soren Aldrich's primary collector, a man who had sat at the Voss kitchen table, picking his teeth while the foreclosure was discussed. Emerson's fight-or-flight response didn't just activate, it exploded. His inner distress sense spiked so violently, tearing right through the chemical blockers, that 2 ordinary pedestrians on the sidewalk turned around in confusion, looking for the source of the sudden, suffocating wave of fear. Poke didn't see him through the rain. Emerson ducked backward into the shadows of the doorway, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Portland was far too close. Aldrich possessed resources, patience, and connections across the entire Pacific Northwest. Emerson left the shop within the hour. Greta didn't ask a single question. She simply counted out his remaining wages in cash, slid a warm bag of leftover pork buns into his pack, and wished him luck with the grim solidarity of someone who understood what it meant to run from bad men. He caught a northbound bus that night, then a westbound transfer, zigzagging across state lines in a desperate bid to scrub his digital and physical trail, sleeping upright against frosted windows, eating cheap, processed food from gas stations. He finally ran out of money at the end of the line, Seattle, Washington. The city was vast enough to vanish into, cold enough to discourage casual searching, and permanently shrouded in the kind of gray, heavy mist that muted everything including sense. Emerson managed to rent a microscopic room in a rundown boarding house down in Soto, south of the massive industrial stadiums. It was a gritty, industrial part of the city that smelled constantly of salt water, heavy diesel exhaust, and the quiet, crushing loneliness of places that exist solely between other destinations. The room was sparse, a squeaking metal cot, a single shelf, a communal bathroom down the hall, a working deadbolt, and a window that overlooked a gravel parking lot where semi-trucks idled through the night. The house was managed by an ancient half-deaf beta named Walter, who demanded cash every Sunday morning and never asked for an ID or a real name. Emerson paid for the first week, dropped his backpack on the floor, and immediately walked the gray, wet blocks searching for manual labor. He found it 3 streets away at a place called Lattice, a small, independent commercial bakery and coffee shop that catered to the early morning shift workers from the docks and rail yards. Nobody wanted the graveyard shift. The hours were brutal, 1 a.m. to 8 a.m. Emerson wanted exactly that. He desperately craved the hours when normal, respectable people slept, the dark, empty window of the world where nobody would be looking for a runaway Omega from Montana. The owner was Hana Kim, a sharp-eyed beta woman in her mid-50s, with white flour permanently embedded in the deep creases of her knuckles, and a booming, gravelly laugh that could fill the entire storefront. She hired Emerson within 3 minutes of meeting him, because he possessed an innate, quiet understanding of dough. His mother had taught him the patience of yeast, and because he actually smiled when she told him the shift started at 1 in the morning. Within a week, he fell into a rigid, protective routine. Routine was the architecture that kept him upright. It was the only thing preventing his mind from collapsing into paranoia. At 1 a.m., the city would be completely silent, slick with black rain. Emerson would unlock the heavy security grate of the bakery, step into the cold kitchen, and turn on the industrial ovens. Flour, water, salt, yeast. The physical work was grounding. He loved the quiet hours when the dough rose in the darkness. The rich, warm living smell of fermentation was the only clean thing left in his life. His own natural scent remained deeply buried beneath maximum strength chemical blockers that he swallowed like candy, leaving a permanent bitter metallic tang at the back of his throat and keeping his skin smelling like nothing but laundry detergent and medicine. He baked continuously until the morning front-of-house crew arrived at 5 a.m., then transitioned to scrubbing the heavy mixing bowls, walking back to the Soto boarding house in the pale, fog-choked morning light. He would sleep through the loud afternoon, wake up in the dark, and repeat the entire cycle. He didn't make friends. He didn't introduce himself to the other shopkeepers. He did absolutely nothing that might place his face or his name into the memory of a person who might later be questioned. He was a ghost who baked exceptional bread, and for 4 weeks that was enough. It likely would have stayed enough for a very long time, if the bakery hadn't been located exactly 3 blocks from the nondescript brick warehouse where Caleb Vance ran the most powerful criminal syndicate south of the Ship Canal. Emerson didn't understand who, or what, Caleb was when the men first started appearing in the shop. They arrived every single morning like clockwork at 4:30 a.m. They usually came in pairs or groups of 3, dressed in dark, expensive tailored coats, moving with the easy, fluid spatial awareness of people who automatically checked the structural exits and noted the camera angles before choosing a seat. They ordered dark roast coffee and whatever pastry had just come out of the rack. They were exceptionally polite. They tipped in $20 bills, and they terrified Emerson in a low, ambient, primal way he couldn't rationalize. It wasn't due to anything they said or did, it was what they were. Every single one of them was an alpha, and not the soft, suburban variety Emerson had seen in Portland. Men who checked corporate spreadsheets or coached middle school sports. These men carried a lethal, territorial edge in their baseline pheromones. It was heavy, watchful, and highly disciplined. Emerson's deep-seated omega instincts read them with terrifying clarity, prey-tracking apex predators. One alpha came in every single morning without fail. His name was Tyler. He was tall, lean, with close-cropped dark hair, a sharply carved jawline, and a permanent air of calm authority. Tyler would order a black coffee and a plain croissant, sit in the isolated corner booth near the back, read text files on his phone, and never once looked directly at Emerson with anything more than polite, professional disinterest. In a strange way, that complete lack of attention was actually worse. Emerson could feel the man's trained senses, registering every movement, every breath, and every visual detail in the room, without ever appearing to look up from his screen. Then, 4 weeks into the routine, Tyler brought someone else with him. It was a freezing Wednesday. Emerson was behind the counter, using heavy canvas gloves to pull a steaming tray of artisanal sourdough rolls from the deck ovens, when the brass bell above the front door chimed. 2 sets of heavy boots stepped onto the linoleum, and the entire atmospheric pressure within the bakery instantly mutated. It didn't feel warmer or colder, it felt heavier. It was the unmistakable, suffocating drop in barometric pressure that precedes a severe electrical storm. The moment your physical body senses the lightning before your brain can even process the clouds. Emerson turned around, his chest tightening. The man standing beside Tyler was broader through the shoulders, taller, with dark, thick hair pushed back from a face that could only be described as handsome in a stark, industrial sort of way. Clean lines, raw function, absolutely nothing wasted. He wore a heavy black leather jacket that had been worn soft at the cuffs and along the wide collar. But it was his scent that arrived before Emerson's eyes could even fully map the contours of his face. It was an absolute sledgehammer of a profile, rich, dark coffee grounds, the bitter tang of cold structural steel, and deep underneath, a massive, resonant note of wood smoke and dry cedar. Emerson's biological core answered that scent before his intellect could form a single thought. The dormant glands beneath his ears instantly warmed, flushing hot against the chemical blockers. His hands on the edges of the baking tray went completely rigid. The man in the leather jacket looked at Emerson. It wasn't the polite, sweeping glance Tyler used. This was a gaze that stopped, landed, and anchored itself into place. Emerson felt it against his skin the way direct, blistering sunlight feels after a long, dark winter indoors. It was an evaluation that felt entirely physical. Coffee, Tyler told Emerson, already stepping past the counter toward their usual corner booth. 2 cups, black. The man in the jacket didn't say a word. He continued to stare at Emerson for another 2 seconds. Seconds that stretched out until the ticking of the kitchen wall clock sounded like a hammer, then slowly followed Tyler to the back booth. He sat down, his back to the wall, and said absolutely nothing. "That's Vance," Hannah whispered 20 minutes later, leaning over the zinc counter as she wiped down the espresso machine. She dropped the name with the casual calm of a woman describing a permanent weather pattern. "Caleb Vance. He runs the entire waterfront in this district. Don't let it shake you, kid. He isn't the kind of trouble that ever reaches people who bake bread." Emerson looked down at his flour-dusted apron, his heart still adjusting its rhythm. "What kind of trouble is he, exactly?" Hannah wrung out her cleaning cloth, draping it carefully over the chrome faucet. "The quiet sort. The kind that keeps the peace until someone gives him a very expensive reason to stop being quiet." She glanced sideways at Emerson, her eyes softening. "He's been in Sodo for a decade. His people are regulars here. They don't cause disruptions, they never run a tab, and just last winter, two of his night shift guys walked one of our servers all the way to her car because some drunk from the sports bar was trailing her down the alley. I don't ask what he unloads from the shipping containers, and he doesn't ask why my taxes are filed the way they are. It works out fine for everybody." Emerson nodded silently. He understood the profound survival value of not knowing things. But that night, lying awake on the narrow cot in his dark Sodo room, he couldn't clear his senses of that scent. Dark coffee, cold steel, cedar smoke. His physical body had answered it without his permission, a deep, low, heavy pull in the absolute center of his stomach. It terrified him far more than Garrett Vance ever had. Garrett had frightened his intellect, but this man frightened his blood. Caleb Vance became a daily fixture. Sometimes he arrived flanked by Tyler, other times he came in alone or with a stocky, bald alpha named Riss, who wore a heavy gold chain under his collar. But Caleb himself was the only true constant. 4:30 a.m., the chime of the bell, the instantaneous thickening of the air, the black leather jacket. He always ordered his coffee black, no sugar. He would hand over a clean bill, take the mug, and walk to the corner booth. He never attempted to engage Emerson in small talk. He didn't ask for his name, his phone number, or his history. None of the traditional aggressive maneuvers alphas typically employed when they marked a young Omega working a service counter. He simply drank his coffee, stared out the rain-streaked window at the passing industrial traffic, or checked his phone. But occasionally, Caleb's pale gray eyes so light they looked like polished silver under the harsh kitchen fluorescence, would shift over to the counter. They would rest on Emerson for 5 seconds, 10 seconds, holding him in place, and then move away. Those brief, silent interactions sat heavily in Emerson's chest for the remainder of every shift. Weeks bled into December. Emerson baked. Caleb drank black coffee. Neither broke the boundary of basic commerce. Emerson repeatedly told himself it was nothing more than basic proximity biology, a displaced, traumatized Omega instinct automatically responding to the most powerful alpha in the immediate zip code. It meant absolutely nothing. He repeated this lie every single morning at 4:30 a.m. when the brass bell chimed and his pulse spiked. And every morning the lie grew thinner until it was transparent as rice paper. The first time Caleb actually spoke to him beyond the parameters of an order was a freezing Wednesday morning. Emerson was rolling out a massive sheet of sweet dough for the morning cinnamon rolls, his forearms dusted with white flour. Caleb was at the corner booth alone. The shop was dead silent. Normal citizens didn't buy artisan sourdough at 4 in the morning. The leather booth creaked. Emerson looked up. Caleb was standing at the zinc counter. He wasn't leaning against it, wasn't invading Emerson's space. He was simply standing there, his large hands resting loosely at his sides, his silver eyes fixed directly on Emerson's face. "You're not from the coast," Caleb said. It wasn't a question. It was a flat statement of fact. Emerson's hands froze instantly on the wooden rolling pin. A wave of ice-cold adrenaline flooded his veins. Deep beneath his skin, his glands fought to fire off an emergency distress signal, choked out by the heavy chemical blockers. "No," Emerson whispered, his throat dry. "Montana." Caleb's expression didn't alter by a fraction. "Relax. I didn't have anyone look you up." His voice dropped into a lower, resonant register that vibrated straight through the counter. "You smell like harvested wheat under all those synthetic blockers. Wheat, hard winters, and deep soil. It's either Montana or the Dakotas." Emerson's fingers were trembling so violently he had to press his palms flat against the cool, sticky dough to conceal the motion. Does it matter where I'm from? Caleb studied him, taking in the defensive posture, the tension in the boy's jaw, the slight tremor in his frame. He reached into his leather jacket, pulled out a crisp $20 bill, and set it softly on the counter between them. It doesn't matter to me, Caleb said evenly, but it matters immensely to whoever you're running from. He paused, his gaze locking onto Emerson's eyes with absolute intensity. In this specific neighborhood, people who want to stay hidden generally manage to stay hidden. That's how the ecosystem works down here. Keep that in mind. Caleb picked up his coffee mug, turned on his heel, and walked back to his booth. Emerson stood behind the counter, the flour drying on his skin, his mind spinning in circles. He couldn't determine if he had just been subtly threatened or profoundly protected, and that precise uncertainty was the most dangerous, intoxicating thing he had ever encountered. Following that conversation, the atmosphere of the mornings shifted. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but a gradual tectonic realignment, like a season changing 1 degree at a time. Caleb began to linger. He stayed in the corner booth long after his coffee had gone cold. He was a man who possessed an extraordinary comfort with silence. He never spoke simply to fill the void. Emerson, who had been surrounded by people who talked incessantly while saying absolutely nothing of value his entire life, found Caleb's restraint mesmerizing. When the alpha did speak, the comments were always brief, precise, and delivered sideways. He remarked on the sourdough once, offering a single, decisive nod. The crust has more structure this week. You increase the hydration. Emerson had adjusted the water ratio by exactly 2% to compensate for the winter humidity. The realization that this dangerous, imposing man was paying such microscopic attention to the texture of his bread caused Emerson's inner honey note to flare so hard against the blockers that he had to physically turn his back to the counter, pretending to adjust the digital dials on the oven stack to hide the sudden flush on his neck. Another morning, Emerson was quickly stacking fresh loaves onto the cooling racks. His fingers slipped, and a heavy loaf of dark rye slid off the aluminum sheet, hitting the linoleum floor with a loud thud. Emerson flinched so violently his entire right shoulder snapped up toward his ear, the total unvarnished body startle of an animal whose nervous system had been permanently calibrated by physical violence. He caught himself instantly, diving down to retrieve the bread, his face burning as he tried to force his expression back into a mask of normalcy. When he straightened up, Caleb was watching him from the booth. Emerson braced himself for the typical patronizing questions. The "are you okay?" The "what happened to make you jump like that?" The intrusive curiosity of alphas. But Caleb didn't ask a single thing. He simply took a slow sip of his black coffee, looked away from Emerson, and turned his attention back to the rain outside the window. That deliberate lack of an inquiry, that intentional respect for Emerson's privacy, made the young baker feel safer than he had felt since crossing the Montana border. Genuine safety, the kind that slowly settles into the marrow of your bones rather than just hovering on the surface of your skin, makes a person careless. Not careless regarding physical danger, but careless with their emotional walls. Emerson had been running on a high-octane mixture of adrenaline and absolute discipline for so long that when both finally began to evaporate, replaced by the warm routine of the bakery and the unmovable, predictable presence of the alpha in the leather jacket, his defenses didn't drop. They simply grew exhausted and sat down. He stopped checking the alleyway before opening the back door. He stopped sleeping with his heavy work boots on. One Thursday morning, while kneading a double batch of brioche, he caught himself softly humming an old folk melody, a song his mother used to sing during the autumn harvests, a tune he hadn't allowed his mind to touch since he fled Bridger. He began to actively look forward to the 4:30 a.m. chime, feeling a strange, hollow ache in his chest on the rare mornings when Caleb was called away on waterfront business. His natural scent, that rich, complex blend of wild honey and wet stone, began to leak through his skin despite the pills. It wasn't enough for a casual customer to note, but it was more than enough for an experienced alpha. One morning, Tyler looked up from his phone, his nostrils flaring slightly as the warm sweetness drifted into the back booth. The lean alpha looked at Emerson, then turned his eyes directly to Caleb. Caleb, without even looking up from his tablet, gave Tyler the absolute smallest microscopic shake of his head. Tyler instantly dropped his gaze back to his screen, his expression returning to blank professionalism. That silent exchange occurred 3 times over the course of 2 weeks. Emerson never noticed a thing. The leather jacket appeared on a Friday night in mid-December. Caleb had arrived at the shop around 10 p.m., which was highly irregular for his schedule. He brought Tyler, Reese, and 2 older broad-shouldered alphas Emerson had never seen before. They took the large family booth in the very back, speaking in low, gravelly tones that completely failed to carry over the hum of the proofer. Emerson stayed behind the zinc counter, his hands busy preparing the morning laminations, pretending with every fiber of his being that he wasn't tracking every shift in Caleb's posture. When the meeting finally broke an hour later, the men filed out into the freezing Soto rain. Caleb stood at the threshold for a brief moment, looking back across the empty shop at Emerson. For a fraction of a second, the heavy, calculated mask he wore slipped completely, revealing an intense, protective warmth underneath. Then, he stepped out into the dark, but his jacket remained behind. The heavy black leather was draped over the arm of the corner booth, forgotten or intentionally left. Even from across the room, the material radiated Caleb's presence, a physical cloud of dark coffee, cold steel, and cedar wood smoke. Emerson knew exactly what he should have done. He should have picked it up with 2 fingers, carried it to the back office, and placed it inside the lost-and-found cabinet beneath the cash register. Instead, he walked slowly out from behind the counter and stood over the booth, staring down at the leather for a long, silent minute. His physical body made a massive, life-altering decision that his intellect was never consulted on. He was tired. That was the primary justification he offered to his conscience. He was just so profoundly tired. The graveyard shift was a relentless machine that ground a person down to dust. The mattress at the Soto boarding house was nothing but thin foam over rusted springs, and the trucks in the gravel lot outside his window were permanently loud. He was exhausted. The leather booth was cool. The jacket looked heavy and incredibly warm, and the tiny employee back room contained a vintage velvet sofa that Hannah occasionally used for afternoon naps. Nobody would be entering the building for hours. Emerson lifted the jacket. The sheer weight of it surprised him. As he cradled it against his chest, the scent came off the leather in rich, suffocating waves. Coffee, steel, cedar, and deep beneath those elements. An intensely private, magnetic note that belonged solely to the man himself. Caleb. Emerson's throat tightened violently. His eyes burned with a sudden, unexpected heat. He didn't understand the origin of the emotion. He lifted the wide collar, pressing the worn material directly against his face, and took a deep, shuddering breath. The honey and wet stone of his own suppressed heritage rose up from his skin to meet the alpha's profile, entirely unbidden. The 2 scents tangled instantly in the quiet air of the back room. Together, they formed a completely new olfactory reality. A smell Emerson had never encountered in his life, yet recognized instantly. It smelled like fresh summer rain hitting warm mountain pavement. It smelled like heirloom bread rising in a dark oven. It smelled exactly like the good year in Montana, back when the world had been right and his mother had been safe enough to laugh. He didn't make a conscious choice to nest. Nesting wasn't an intellectual decision. It was biological, ancient, and entirely involuntary. It was the Omega body's primal method of constructing an absolute sanctuary around itself the exact moment it encountered an environment that registered as home. Emerson pulled the heavy leather jacket over his shoulders, tucking the cedar-scented collar tight against the side of his neck, directly over the sensitive, unbonded gland where an alpha's mark would go. He curled onto his side on the narrow sofa, drew his knees all the way up to his chest, and literally wrapped himself in the essence of a man whose full name he barely had the right to speak. His body pronounced its absolute final verdict: here safe stay. Emerson, who had never felt safe in Bridger, who couldn't remember the last time his muscles had stopped bracing against the expectation of a blow, closed his eyes. Within 30 seconds, he was completely gone. It was the deepest, most restorative sleep he had experienced since crossing the state line. The profound, unbothered sleep of an animal that had finally found its anchor. Tyler entered the bakery at 5:15 a.m. The morning counter crew wasn't due to unlock the front doors until 5:30, but Tyler had returned early to retrieve the jacket Caleb had left behind. Except Caleb hadn't forgotten it at all. He had driven 3 blocks away, parked his car in the dark, and called Tyler 20 minutes later, instructing his lieutenant to return to the shop under the guise of an oversight. Tyler walked through the kitchen, expecting to find a piece of outerwear draped over a laminate booth. Instead, he pushed open the door to the small back room and came to a dead stop. The young Omega was fast asleep on the velvet sofa, almost entirely swallowed by Caleb's massive black leather jacket. The collar was jammed tight against his neck gland, his features completely smoothed out for the very first time since Tyler had clocked him. Emerson's true, unvarnished scent completely filled the small room. The synthetic blockers had surrendered entirely to biology. It was a massive, intoxicating wave of honey and wet stone, warm and completely open, perfectly fused with Caleb's signature of coffee and steel. The combination was so potent, so undeniably bonded in its profile, that Tyler's own alpha instincts immediately commanded him to look at the floor out of sheer respect for his boss's territory. A shadow fell over the threshold. Reese appeared behind Tyler, his nostrils flaring as he caught the air, his jaw dropping open. Tyler didn't say a word. He placed his large palm flat against Reese's chest and physically shoved the stocky alpha backward out of the kitchen, driving him all the way into the front retail space. He pulled the back room door mostly shut, leaving it open just a crack so the sleeping boy wouldn't feel trapped if he woke up suddenly. Tyler pulled his phone from his coat, dialing a number he knew by heart. "Vance," Tyler murmured into the receiver, a long pause on the other end. The sound of a car engine idling in the background. "Did you get it?" Caleb's voice was low, gravelly. "He's wearing it," Tyler said simply. Dead silence over the line. Tyler could hear the rhythmic, controlled sound of his boss's breathing. "He's nesting with it, boss," Tyler continued softly. "Completely out. His scent is all the way up. I've never smelled an Omega profile that strong from someone taking high-dose blockers. It's everywhere." Another massive stretch of silence. When Caleb spoke again, his voice had dropped into a terrifyingly quiet, fiercely protective register. "Do not wake him." "Wasn't planning on it," Tyler replied. "Don't let anyone from the morning shift into the back hall." "Already handled." Reese is watching the front counter. "And Tyler?" "Yeah, boss?" "Don't you dare tell him I left it on purpose." The line went completely dead. Tyler pocketed his phone, turning to look at Reese. The bald alpha was standing near the pastry cases, a fresh croissant frozen halfway to his mouth, his eyebrows practically merged with his hairline. "I didn't see a single thing," Tyler announced with absolute iron finality. Reese looked at the closed backroom door, then at Tyler's steady stare, then down at his breakfast. "Me neither," Reese confirmed and took a massive bite. Emerson woke up at precisely 5:45 a.m. He was warm, incredibly, beautifully warm. He was surrounded by a scent so profound it took his sleep-fogged brain 10 full seconds to interpret reality. When understanding finally arrived, it brought a wave of pure, unadulterated horror. He scrambled off the velvet sofa, the heavy leather jacket sliding off his shoulders onto the floor. His face went instantly hot, his blood roaring in his ears. His scent was absolutely everywhere. The room was a biological confession. Anyone walking down the hallway would know within a millisecond what an unbonded Omega's body had been doing with an Alpha's clothing. He had nested with a stranger's jacket, and not just any stranger, but the jacket of a man who controlled the entire criminal underworld of Sodo, a man whose lethal enforcers were likely standing in the next room. They would know that Emerson's biology had identified their terrifying boss as home. He wanted the floorboards to open up and swallow him whole. Instead, his survival instincts kicked back in. He stood up, picked up the jacket with trembling fingers, and folded it with mechanical precision. He carried it into the front shop, hung it carefully on the coat hook beside the entry door, and sprinted into the employee bathroom. He scrubbed his wrists, his jawline, and the base of his neck with industrial-grade scent neutralizing soap until his skin was raw, red, and bleeding. By the time Hannah walked through the front door at 6 a.m., Emerson was behind the zinc counter, rolling out croissant dough with absolute rigid focus. His hands were perfectly steady. His face was an unreadable mask. He had swallowed double his usual dosage of chemical blockers. But his neck glands were still burning hot beneath his skin, and the ghost of Caleb's cedar smoke was deeply embedded into the collar of his own shirt. No amount of industrial soap was ever going to wash that away. Caleb Vance walked into Lattice at 4:30 a.m. the following morning. Emerson was behind the counter. The black leather jacket was hanging on the brass hook by the door. Neither man looked at it. Neither man made direct eye contact for a long, heavy moment. Caleb walked calmly to the hook, took the jacket, and slid his arms into the sleeves with the easy, practiced motion of a man putting on a piece of his own soul. The leather creaked softly in the quiet shop. Emerson braced himself for the execution. He waited for the knowing smirk, the arrogant alpha comment, the subtle look that would confirm Tyler had talked, and the entire crew knew the little baker had been caught in a state of total biological submission. Caleb walked up to the zinc counter. His silver eyes met Emerson's gaze with absolute, unyielding stillness. "Coffee," Caleb said, his voice a low, smooth baritone. "Black, no sugar." The exact same order he had given every morning for 2 months. Absolutely nothing else. Emerson poured the coffee, his breath catching in his throat. When he handed the heavy ceramic mug over, their fingers didn't touch. Caleb took the handle, walked back to his usual corner booth, sat down with his back to the wall, and opened his phone. The morning continued exactly as it always had. Nobody mentioned the back room. Nobody mentioned the scent. Emerson stood behind the counter and felt a tiny hairline fracture run straight through the center of the defensive wall he had spent months constructing. It was thin, incredibly warm, and it traveled from the very base of his throat all the way to the pit of his stomach. The fracture only maddened over the following weeks, because Caleb didn't push. The alpha never brought up the jacket. He didn't alter his daily baseline behavior. He never arrived at the shop with flowers, expensive gifts, or any of the performative alpha courtship signals that Emerson had been conditioned by his past to flinch away from. He simply continued to arrive at 4:30 a.m., order his black coffee, and occupy his corner booth. And that absolute, unyielding reliability, the sheer predictability of a dangerous man who showed up every single morning and expected absolutely nothing in return, did something to Emerson's traumatized nervous system that no amount of running could ever achieve. It quieted his alarms. Not a surface-level calm, but a deep structural settling, a bone-level peace that took root in the absolute basement of his psychology, where the true terrors lived. Emerson stopped flinching when a metal tray banged in the kitchen. He stopped checking the deadbolt every 30 seconds. One morning, while serving an elderly beta woman, he caught himself smiling, a real, unpracticed, genuine smile. The sensation of his own facial muscles performing an authentic act of joy felt so utterly foreign that he physically touched his mouth afterward, checking to see if it was real. Caleb noticed. He didn't say a word, but his silver eyes tracked the movement of Emerson's lips and lingered there for a single beat. When the alpha turned back to his tablet, the very corner of his own mouth twitched upward. It wasn't a full smile, just the silent, private acknowledgement of one. The fracture in Emerson's wall widened another inch. The true shift occurred entirely by accident. Emerson was finishing his shift, stepping out the heavy metal back door of the bakery into the gray, freezing alleyway, when he found Caleb leaning casually against the brick wall. The alpha was talking into his phone, his voice a low, terrifying rasp that carried a distinct, lethal edge. The tone of a man directing operations. Emerson knew he had no business understanding. Caleb saw the boy step out. He instantly held up a single gloved finger. Emerson should have kept walking. Every survival instinct he owned should have driven him down the street toward his boarding house. Instead, his boots glued themselves to the damp asphalt. He waited. Caleb ended the call, sliding the phone into his heavy black coat. "You walk home alone every morning?" "Yes," Emerson whispered, his breath clouding in the freezing air. "Through Sodo, at 6 in the morning, in the dark." "It's only 3 blocks, Mr. Vance." Caleb pushed himself off the brick wall. The leather of his jacket creaked softly. A sudden burst of cedar smoke and home cut through the damp alley air. Emerson's neck gland instantly flushed beneath his scarf. "I'll walk you," Caleb said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't an authoritarian command. It was an offer that carried the physical weight of an iron vault door. Emerson understood, down in his gut, that saying no was an actual option. Caleb would let him walk away. But he also understood that saying yes was a completely different kind of yes. "Okay," Emerson said softly. They walked those 3 blocks through the heart of Sodo in the gray, fog-choked December dawn. They passed rusted loading docks, shuttered industrial storefronts, and the massive, sleeping silhouettes of commercial delivery trucks. They didn't exchange a single word. Caleb walked consistently on the street side, positioning his massive, broad-shouldered frame directly between Emerson and the open road. It was the classic protective alpha alignment, placing the body between the omega and the unknown vulnerabilities of the world. By all rights, it should have bothered Emerson. If Garrett Vance had done that, it would have felt possessive, a toxic claim disguised as standard courtesy. But with Caleb, it didn't feel like a claim. It felt exactly like standing next to a mountain wall that happened to smell like cedar and moved at his precise pace. They came to a stop outside the rusted iron door of the Soto boarding house. "Thank you," Emerson said, his hands tucked deep into his pockets. "Don't thank me." Caleb's silver eyes moved slowly up the facade of the building, assessing the structural vulnerabilities, the lack of security cameras, the cheap locks. He mapped the environment with the trained precision Emerson had seen him use on rooms and men. The Alpha's jaw tightened visually, then slowly released. "Same time tomorrow." "You don't have to do this," Emerson offered gently. "I know I don't have to," Caleb said, his voice dropping into that dark, resonant register. Emerson looked down at his shoes, at the cracked concrete of the sidewalk, then back at the boarding house door, a door that locked but not well, a door that led to a room that was clean, but never truly safe. Not how safe felt right now, standing next to this terrifying man in the gray dawn light. "Same time tomorrow," Emerson agreed. The morning walks transformed into an absolute ritual. 6 a.m., Caleb waiting by the metal back door. 3 blocks through the Soto cold. Sometimes they moved in total, comfortable silence. Other times they traded small, guarded scraps of information. The careful currency that two highly protective people exchange when they are learning each other's boundaries. Emerson learned that Caleb had been raised in the brutal, traditional wards of South Boston. He learned that his father had run the docks before him, and his father before him. Caleb had been forced to take over the entire family operation at 22 when his father suffered a massive, debilitating stroke. He learned that Caleb had a younger sister living in Vancouver whom he visited once a year without fail, and called every single Sunday evening at precisely 7 p.m. He discovered that Caleb read history books, massive, leather-bound volumes about ancient wars and dead civilizations that normal people had forgotten centuries ago. The Alpha could name every single Roman emperor in chronological order. That detail was so absurdly unexpected from a man who controlled the shipping lanes of South Seattle that Emerson actually laughed out loud when he heard it. A sharp, startled, beautiful sound that echoed off the concrete loading docks. Caleb stopped walking instantly. He turned and looked down at Emerson with an expression that was, for the first time, completely devoid of armor. "What?" Emerson asked, his cheeks flushing pink as his laughter died down. "Nothing," Caleb said softly, his silver eyes fixed on the boy's face. He started walking again, his pace slightly slower. After a long moment, he spoke quietly into the frost. "I didn't know you could do that." "Do what?" "Laugh." The single word hung in the freezing air between them. Emerson felt a sudden ache in his chest. He understood. Caleb had been watching him for months, tracking his movements, and he had never once heard the boy produce a sound of genuine happiness. Hearing it now mattered to the Alpha in a way the man would never explicitly explain. The inner honey note rose up hot beneath Emerson's collar, and this time he didn't try to push it back down. Caleb learned things about Emerson too, though the Omega never offered his history the way ordinary people shared their lives. He offered his past in fractured halves, in sentences that started with purpose and trailed off into silence. Caleb never pushed for the missing words. Emerson told him about the wheat fields. He told him about his mother's hands, which were always rough but could handle dough with incredible delicacy. He told him about his very first independent bake at 12 years old, how the loaf had come out dense, heavy, and flat as a stone, and how his mother had eaten 2 massive slices anyway, looking him in the eye and calling it the finest bread she had ever tasted. He told Caleb this at 5:30 on a bleak Tuesday morning, standing outside the boarding house, and his voice cracked cleanly on the word mother. Caleb looked at him. He didn't reach out. He didn't attempt to touch Emerson's shoulder, and he didn't deploy any empty, patronizing comfort. He simply stood there, steady, unmovable, and profoundly present, letting Emerson's voice crack in the cold air without trying to force it fixed. That was the core of it. Caleb Vance never tried to fix anything. He didn't offer superficial solutions or cheap corporate reassurances. He simply stood in the dark space with whatever weight Emerson was carrying and allowed it to be heavy, never once flinching from the mass of it. Emerson, who had spent his entire life around people who desperately needed him to be lighter, easier, and more pleasant to accommodate their own failures, found that being allowed to be heavy was the most profoundly disarming thing anyone had ever done to his soul. Christmas passed in a blur of flour and rain. Emerson worked through the holiday, baking hundreds of loaves of Stalin and gingerbread for the neighborhood. He didn't call Montana. He stood in the damp hallway of the boarding house, staring at the payphone for 10 long minutes, then slowly hung up the receiver and went to bed. Caleb walked into Lattice at 4:30 a.m. on Christmas morning. Same order, same booth. When Emerson brought the black coffee over, a small, neatly wrapped package was sitting on the zinc counter. There was no card attached. Inside was a thick, dark blue wool scarf, heavy, expensive, and clearly bought for someone who walked 3 blocks through the Soto fog every morning without dressing warmly enough. Emerson looked at the blue wool, then over at the corner booth. Caleb was already deep into his phone, his face an absolute granite wall that offered no acknowledgement. Emerson wrapped the scarf around his neck. It was incredibly soft, warm, and smelled faintly of wood smoke and cedar. He wore it every single day after that. Neither man ever spoke of the giving or the wearing, and that unspoken contract became another heavy strand in the invisible web tightening between them. A reality neither named, because naming it would require admitting it existed, and admitting it existed would require deciding what to do about the danger of it. The terror Emerson had been running from for 3 states finally arrived on a Thursday morning in mid-January. He was behind the zinc counter at 4 a.m., completely alone in the front shop, shaping loaves of rye. The front door opened. The brass bell chimed. Emerson looked up automatically, expecting to see Tyler or Reese arriving early. Instead, his eyes landed on a man he didn't recognize physically, but whose biological profile hit the room like a chemical spill. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp, reddish-brown hair, and a face that was undeniably handsome in a cruel, aristocratic sort of way. His scent arrived a millisecond before he spoke, a thick, suffocating wave of industrial tar and burnt sugar. It was the aggressive, predatory pheromone signature of an alpha who was entirely accustomed to making rooms smaller simply by entering them. Garrett Vance, or Garrett Slade, the rival alpha from Billings. Emerson's hands went completely still on the dough. An absolute paralyzing ice flooded his chest. It was the primitive, gut-wrenching cold of a prey animal that had been tracked to the absolute end of the forest. He had never met this man in person. He had only ever seen a single photograph inside Soren Aldrich's ledger, but his blood recognized the predator instantly. Garrett smiled. It was the polished, patient smile of a wolf that was entirely done with the chase. "Quite a run, sweetheart," Garrett said, his voice smooth, echoing off the bakery walls. "Montana, Portland, 3 different buses through 4 states. You're significantly more resourceful than I gave your family credit for." His eyes traveled slowly down Emerson's frame, a flat transactional evaluation that felt exactly like a livestock appraisal. "You look thin. You smell like generic chemicals. Standing behind a soda counter at 4 in the morning. Is this what you thought freedom looked like?" Emerson's trembling hands pressed flat against the zinc counter to keep from collapsing. How did you find me?" "Soren Aldrich has associates in every port city on the coast," Garrett explained, leaning casually against the pastry case. "You used your real name to sign the register at that pathetic boarding house down the street. Walter, a lovely old beta, very cooperative when someone offers to clear his entire back taxes." Emerson's stomach dropped into a void. "Your father defaulted on the loan 2 months ago, Emerson," Garrett continued, his voice dropping into a casual purr. "Aldrich took the acreage. The farm is gone. Your parents are currently living in your mother's sister's guest bedroom in Bozeman. All of this could have been so easily avoided." Garrett stepped closer, his tar scent thickening in the warm shop. "The arrangement still stands. Come back to Billings with me tonight. The family debt gets transferred into a structured payment plan. Your father gets his land back. Don't come with me. And the debt gets sold to a collection outfit that operates with significantly less civility." He tilted his head, his eyes dark. "Your choice, sweetheart. The math is very simple." The brass bell above the door chimed softly. A draft of freezing Soto air cut through the room. Garrett turned his head. Caleb Vance stood in the open doorway. He was alone. He wasn't wearing his leather jacket tonight, just a long, dark wool overcoat, buttoned tightly to the chin, his hands resting loosely at his. His face held the absolute terrifying stillness of a man who had walked into a room and calculated every single variable, every relationship, and every threat in less than a second. His scent flooded the bakery like a tidal wave. Dark coffee, cold structural steel, cedar smoke. It didn't mingle with Garrett's profile, it physically smashed against it, driving the tar and burnt sugar backward toward the counter. The biological pressure between the two alphas dropped so fast that Emerson's ears literally popped. Garrett straightened up to his full height. He was a massive man, broad and imposing, entirely accustomed to being the absolute center of gravity in any room he occupied. But Caleb wasn't about physical size. Caleb was about density. He occupied space completely, bending the atmospheric reality around him until the bakery felt like his personal concrete vault. "We're closed," Caleb said. His voice was completely flat, entirely calm. The precise tone of a man who was not calm at all, and was simply choosing not to show the scale of his rage. Garrett looked him up and down, his nostrils flaring as he measured the other alpha's weight. "I'm having a private conversation with my property. The conversation is over." Garrett's smile thinned into a sneer. "You don't know what this is about, friend." "I know with absolute certainty what this is about," Caleb said. He hadn't moved an inch from the threshold. He didn't need to. "You're standing in my neighborhood. You're standing in my regular bakery. And you're terrifying an Omega who doesn't deserve to be terrified." His silver eyes shifted over to Emerson for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Emerson to witness the white-hot fury pulsing beneath the surface. Then, Caleb's gaze locked back onto Garrett. "Leave the city tonight. Do not let me catch your car on this side of the canal again." "Or what?" Garrett barked, his voice dropping into an aggressive dominant growl, a direct alpha challenge. Caleb dropped his own register below it, going incredibly quiet, incredibly cold, the sound of a deep river going perfectly silent right before it drops over a cliff. "Or I make a single phone call to Soren Aldrich," Caleb said softly. "And I explained to him that the collector he sent into Seattle has been operating in Vansa territory without an introduction, without paying tribute, and without explicit permission. In this city, that is a terminal breach of protocol. I am entirely within my rights to settle that breach however I see fit." A long, agonizing pause stretched out. "Then, I make a second phone call to a contact in Billings who owes me 3 very large favors regarding the agricultural distribution channels you run through the northern corridor. We'll see how vulnerable your entire enterprise looks when the Port Authority decides to run a structural audit on your supply chain." Garrett's aristocratic face changed instantly. The arrogant smile vanished, replaced by the pale, sudden realization of a man who had come to collect a small, rural debt and discovered himself standing in the gears of a massive industrial machine. "This isn't your business, Vance," Garrett hissed, though his posture had shifted back 6 inches. "Everything south of the canal is my personal business," Caleb said, stepping to the side and clearing the path to the street. "That includes the bakery, that includes the Omega behind the zinc, and that includes you right now, standing here without my leave. The door is wide open. Use it." Garrett stared at Caleb. He looked over at Emerson, his jaw working violently, then back at the silver-eyed alpha blocking the light. He left without another word. The brass bell chimed behind him. The thick scent of tar slowly thinned in the cold draft, and the bakery fell into an absolute, ringing silence. Emerson's leg simply gave out. It wasn't a dramatic, theatrical collapse. His knees simply ceased to function as load-bearing structures. He dropped straight down behind the counter, landing hard on the flour-dusted linoleum floor. He pressed his back against the wooden cabinets, pulled his knees to his chest, and tried to force air into his lungs. It didn't work. The panic was a physical hand around his windpipe. Garrett had found him. The blockers had failed. The farm was gone. His parents were ruined, sleeping in a guest room in Bozeman because their only son had run away instead of staying to be sold. A soft sound echoed on the floor. Caleb had walked behind the counter. The massive alpha didn't stand over him, and he didn't reach down to pull him up. He simply sat straight down on the floorboards beside him, his back resting against the exact same wooden cabinet. Their shoulders weren't touching, but they were close enough that Emerson could feel the raw, radiating heat of the man's body. They sat together in the white flour dust, in the absolute quiet of the early morning. Caleb said nothing. Emerson could say nothing. The silence stretched out, until it was the only thing left in the universe. And then the wall completely came down. Emerson's natural scent broke through the maximum strength chemical blockers entirely. It wasn't a slow leak, it was a catastrophic biological flood. Honey and wet stone poured from his skin, raw, unguarded, thick with absolute distress. And underneath that sweetness, a darker, deeply buried note he had been hiding even from his own consciousness finally broke free, the desperate, vibrating, reaching frequency that an omega body only produces when it begs to be claimed. The pure omega call. I am terrified, and you are here, and I need you to hold me. Caleb went completely rigid beside him. Emerson could feel the man's rhythmic breathing hitch, then transition into a slow, intensely controlled cadence. The deliberate, agonizing discipline of an alpha, fighting every single primal instinct in his DNA. The cedar wood smoke note in Caleb's scent deepened, turning incredibly warm, radiating a protective aura that felt like a thick blanket. But his hands remained resting flat on his own knees. They hadn't moved an inch toward the boy. I'm going to put my arm around you, Emerson, Caleb said. His voice was rough, completely stripped of its flat, professional control. If you do not want me to touch you, tell me to stop right now. Emerson didn't tell him to stop. He couldn't. Caleb's massive arm came around his shoulders. The instant the physical contact was made, Emerson turned into the alpha's chest with pure, blind biological instinct. He buried his face deep into the side of Caleb's neck, pressing his nose directly against the primary scent gland where the coffee, steel, and cedar were concentrated. His own scent rose up to meet the profile. Together they filled the floor behind the counter with that beautiful, resonant reality. Summer rain on warm pavement, artisan bread rising in the dark, the legendary Goodyear in Montana. Emerson shook violently against the alpha's frame. He didn't shed tears. His grief was too deep for water. But his fingers dug frantically into the fabric of Caleb's shirt, holding on for dear life. For the first time since he left Bridger, his body completely stopped bracing against the world. He felt held together by an iron framework that nothing could break. They sat on the floor for a long time. Emerson's ragged breathing gradually steadied, his tremors slowed to a stop. Caleb's arm remained heavy, warm, and unyielding, not pinning him in place, but simply holding him together. When Emerson finally pulled his face back, his skin was dry, but his eyes were bloodshot and raw. Caleb's collar had a distinct damp patch where the boy had been buried. Neither man made mention of it. I need to tell you, Emerson whispered, his voice completely wrecked. You don't have to tell me a single thing, Caleb murmured, his silver eyes fixed on the boy's face. I want to, Emerson said, looking down at Caleb's large, scarred knuckles. Because you're the only person who didn't ask. He took a deep breath, forcing the words out. My family owes a predatory debt. Soren Aldrich runs the lending operations back home. My father borrowed more than the land could produce. When the foreclosure came, Aldrich offered to wipe the slate completely clean. In exchange for a signed bonding contract, Garrett Vance was the buyer. I was supposed to be handed over in November. I ran instead. I left them with nothing. Now the farm is gone. Caleb was quiet for a long, heavy minute. His jaw worked silently. What do you want, Emerson? Emerson blinked. Nobody had ever asked him that question. Not his father, not his mother, not Aldrich, not Garrett. None of the people who had spent years calculating the exact economic value of his flesh. I want to stay here, Emerson said, his voice cracking cleanly on the word stay. I want to keep baking bread at 4 a.m. I want to walk home with you through the Soto fog. I don't want to be sold. His hand instinctively moved up to shield his neck gland. And I want my parents to be safe. And I know those two things cannot both be true. Caleb reached over. He took Emerson's hand, the one covering the neck gland, and gently pulled it away. He held the boy's fingers in his own massive palm. He didn't squeeze, and he didn't pull. He just held it. I'm going to build you a completely different door, Emerson, Caleb said, his voice dropping into an absolute vow. One that doesn't cost your freedom. Emerson looked at him, his heart hammering. Why? Caleb stared back, the crime lord mask completely discarded. What lay underneath wasn't soft. It was too heavy for softness, but it was unmovable. The face of a man who had made a decision and would dismantle the world before he went back on it. Because you aren't collateral, Caleb said, his voice vibrating through Emerson's fingers. You aren't livestock. You aren't good stock. He paused, his silver eyes catching the light. You're the first human being in 10 years who made this miserable bakery smell like home. Caleb handled it, That was the extraordinary thing about him. He wasn't a man who promised things and then vanished into a bureaucratic process. He made a single 5-minute phone call from the corner booth at 4:45 a.m. while Emerson shaped loaves with shaking hands. By noon the following day, the entire reality of eastern Montana had shifted on its axis. Emerson never learned the exact details of the leverage applied. Caleb kept that world entirely separate, but he knew that Tyler had driven out of Seattle that afternoon and returned 48 hours later with a folder of signed notarized documents. Soren Aldrich's predatory debt had been legally restructured, stripped of its compounding interest rates, and converted into standard corporate terms that a wheat farmer could actually meet. The bonding contract with Garrett Vance was legally declared null and void. Garrett returned to Billings and stayed there. Most importantly, the Voss family was given an exclusive option to purchase their land back at fair market value through a new commercial lender, whose terms were so reasonable they made Aldrich look like the criminal he was. Ann Voss called the Soto boarding house 2 days later. Walter came up the stairs and knocked heavily on Emerson's door. Emerson walked down the narrow, dark hallway to the shared landline, lifted the receiver, and heard his mother's voice for the first time in 4 months. "Emerson," she gasped, her voice thick with tears. "Emerson, someone bought out the entire debt. They restructured everything. Your father has the keys to the acreage back. The bank signed off this morning. Honey, who did this?" Emerson leaned his forehead against the peeling wallpaper of the hallway wall, his eyes closing as a wave of profound relief washed over him. "Someone who thinks I'm worth more than collateral, Mom." His mother was silent for a long, beautiful moment over the static of the long-distance line. "Are you safe, Emerson?" "Yeah, Mom, I'm safe." "Are you happy?" Emerson thought about the warm kitchen at Lattice, the 4:30 a.m. orders, the 3 blocks through the gray fog, the black leather jacket hanging on the brass hook, and the dangerous man who had sat on the floorboards with him and simply asked what he wanted. "I'm getting there," Emerson said. Following that call, the defensive walls came down in earnest. It wasn't the gradual lean of the previous months, it was a sudden, total collapse. Years of hypervigilant self-protection simply surrendered at once. Emerson stopped taking the chemical blockers. It wasn't a conscious, planned decision. He simply woke up one Tuesday morning, looked at the amber pill bottle on his shelf, and didn't open it. When he realized halfway through his shift that his true scent was fully up, filling the entire front storefront with the rich warmth of honey and wet stone, he didn't reach for his apron to hide. The morning counter crew noticed immediately. Hannah looked at him once, her eyes tracking the exposed, sensitive skin of his neck where the gland was visibly pulsing with warmth. She gave him a beautiful, knowing smile and went right back to boxing pastries without saying a word. When Caleb walked through the door at 4:30 a.m., Emerson's scent reached out for him across the entire length of the retail shop. The two profiles fused instantly. Together, they filled the room with that unmistakable fragrance of summer rain and rising bread. Every single alpha present in the shop went perfectly still. Tyler dropped his head. Reese fixed his eyes entirely on his coffee cup with immense respect. Caleb stood at the counter. His silver eyes were fixed on Emerson's face. The flat, unreadable mask was gone, replaced by a dark, intense patience that was clearly running out of time. "You took the blockers off," Caleb said, his voice a low vibration. "I did," Emerson said steadily. "Are you certain, Emerson?" "I'm certain." A massive door opened behind Caleb's expression. "I'm taking you to dinner tonight. A real dinner, not a pastry at a booth." Emerson felt his pulse quicken. "What time?" 7 o'clock. I'll meet you outside." "I'll be ready." The dinner took place at a secluded, historic restaurant in Pioneer Square. It was a beautiful, subterranean space, with dim lighting, heavy exposed brick, massive timber tables, and a menu that didn't feature prices. Caleb sat across the table wearing a simple dark button-down shirt. He hadn't brought his leather jacket. He had left his armor in the car. The absence of the heavy leather made him look younger, less lethal, and remarkably exposed. They ate slowly, and they talked. Caleb spoke openly about South Boston, about the reality of taking over a syndicate at 22, about the years of calculated violence, and the heavy compromises required to keep a waterfront stable. He laid his history out plainly, without a single shred of glamour or romanticism. "I've done things that keep me awake until the dawn, Emerson," Caleb said. staring directly into his wineglass. I will likely have to do them again. You need to understand exactly what I am before this goes any further. Emerson set his fork down on the linen cloth. I know exactly what you are, Caleb. I've known since Hannah told me your name. I stayed because you sat on a dirty floor and asked me what I wanted. Nobody has ever done that for me. Everyone in my life has spent years telling me what I should want, what I owe the family, and what is expected of my blood. He felt his voice going rough, thick with emotion. I want this. I want you sitting across a table being completely honest about the darkest parts of your life. I want to be the person you don't have to hide the blood from. I've spent my entire existence being pleasant, agreeable, and silent because that was the only thing that kept me alive. You're the first person who ever made me feel safe enough to stop performing. Caleb's silver eyes turned incredibly dark, filled with the sheer mass of everything he had been holding back for 3 months. I am not an easy man to love, Emerson. I am not an easy man to keep. I don't need you to be easy, Emerson said fiercely, so stop warning me away and let me decide for myself. Caleb leaned back into the leather chair. His jaw worked silently. His large hands on the table curled into fists, then slowly opened, palms up. Okay, Caleb whispered, the words stripped entirely raw. Okay. They walked back through the brick plazas of Pioneer Square in the freezing night air. Caleb reached out, his large hand wrapping securely around Emerson's, and for the first time Emerson led the way. The Alpha's palm was rough, calloused, but he held the boy's fingers with a profound gentleness that had no logical business belonging to a man with his reputation. When they reached the Soto boarding house, Emerson stopped at the threshold. Come upstairs, Emerson said softly. Caleb's jaw tightened. I'm not going to force my way into your space, Emerson. I'm not asking you to stay the night, Emerson clarified, his silver eyes catching the street lamp light. I'm asking you to come see where I've been living. You've walked me to this door for 2 months, and you've never once crossed the line. Emerson's room was microscopic, bare and painfully clean. A narrow metal cot, a single wooden shelf containing 3 paperback books, and the faded photograph of his mother tacked to the plaster wall. Caleb stood in the exact center of the small space, his massive shoulders making the room look even smaller. He walked over to the photograph, studying it for a long time. She's smiling, Caleb noted softly. That was the good year, Emerson said, stepping up behind him. Only one? There's only ever one out there. Caleb turned around. The room was so narrow that the movement put them completely clear of space. Their coats brushed, their breath mingling in the cold air. The scents were completely tangled now. Coffee, honey, cedar, and wet stone. Caleb lifted his large hands slowly, deliberately giving Emerson all the time in the world to see the movement, time to step back, time to call a halt. Emerson didn't move an inch. Caleb's palm came to rest against the side of Emerson's neck. His thumb traced the line of the boy's jaw. His wide palm was incredibly hot over the sensitive scent gland. It was a feather-light touch. Emerson could have stepped away without the slightest effort. Instead, he leaned his weight directly into the hand. The cedar smoke deepened instantly. Caleb's professional control wavered. I'm going to kiss you, Emerson, Caleb whispered, his voice barely a rasp against the boy's lips. Tell me no. Emerson didn't say no. The kiss was remarkably slow. It wasn't tentative or uncertain. It was slow with the absolute purpose of an alpha who had been starving for months and intended to catalog every single second of the meal. Caleb's mouth was warm, tasting faintly of red wine, and his hand on Emerson's neck remained perfectly steady, not pressing, not claiming, simply anchoring. Emerson's fingers found the fabric of Caleb's shirt, bunching the cloth in his fists. His true honey note came all the way up, completely open, merging with the cedar until the small boarding house room felt like an ancient forest. And in that moment, Emerson finally understood what the old books meant when they discussed a bond forming. It wasn't the physical bite, it wasn't the scar left behind, it was the quiet, profound moment underneath, the moment your biological core realized it was no longer alone in the dark. Caleb pulled back slowly, his forehead resting flat against Emerson's. They breathed the same air in the narrow room. Stay, Emerson whispered against the alpha's skin. Caleb stayed. He took off his heavy boots and lay down on the narrow metal cot. Emerson curled tightly against his side, his face buried deep into the center of the alpha's chest, listening to the slow, heavy, rhythmic beat of Caleb's heart. They slept, just slept. Two broken, highly protected people who had finally found the one coordinate in the world where their bodies could stop bracing against the horizon. The weeks that followed were beautiful, and the warmth was incredibly complicated. Caleb systematically moved Emerson out of the Soto boarding house and into a spacious, light-filled apartment located directly above Lattice. It was a beautiful one-bedroom space with thick oak floors, a commercial-grade deadbolt, and a massive east-facing window that caught the sunrise over the industrial yards. Caleb hadn't asked for permission. He had simply instructed Tyler to show up on a Friday morning with a set of keys, a box of high-end kitchen supplies, and a short handwritten note. Yours, not mine. The lease is registered in your name. That specific detail mattered immensely to Emerson. Caleb had placed the legal lease in Emerson's name intentionally, ensuring it was his independent property, not a golden cage or a conditional gift that could be retracted if the boy displeased him. Caleb came over almost every evening when the waterfront went quiet. They cooked together, or rather Emerson cooked, while Caleb sat on the laminate counter handing him spices. The crime lord was remarkably terrible at chopping vegetables and made absolutely no effort to pretend otherwise. They ate at the small wooden table by the window, discussing history, Roman emperors, sourdough hydration percentages, and the objective structural horror of putting pineapple on a pizza. After the plates were cleared, Caleb would pull the boy into his lap on the sofa. Emerson would lean his entire weight into the cedar smoke and the slow, unyielding heartbeat, watching the rain slick the Soto streets below while the rest of the world receded into white noise. But Emerson was slowly learning a devastating truth about his own psychology. Finding safety doesn't instantly erase the memory of root beer. It simply sits down right beside it. The terror actually sharpened, because now he possessed something beautiful he couldn't bear to lose. He found himself tracking the notifications on Caleb's phone with the exact same high-wire anxiety he had once used to watch his father count dollar bills at the kitchen table. He began to systematically catalog every late arrival, every tense radio call, and every morning when Caleb's jaw was set 3 millimeters harder than usual. One rain-soaked night in April, Caleb didn't come home at all. Emerson lay wide awake in the dark bedroom until 3 a.m., his inner scent turning sharp and bitter with pure, unadulterated anxiety. His phone was clutched so tightly in his palm, his knuckles were white. At 3:15 a.m., he finally broke protocol and dialed Tyler. "He's perfectly fine, Emerson," Tyler said instantly, his voice calm over the line. "The docs ran late. We had a logistics issue. He'll be back up the stairs by morning." "Where is he right now, Tyler?" Emerson asked, his throat tight. "Handling an administrative matter. He's safe. I am looking directly at him across the concrete right now." "Emerson, go back to sleep." Emerson didn't go back to sleep. He couldn't. He walked down the stairs into the dark kitchen of Lattice. He turned on the industrial lights, pulled a massive stainless steel bowl from the rack, and began to make bread. He mixed flour, water, salt, and yeast entirely in the dark, the windows reflecting his pale, terrified face. Honey and raw panic filled the air of the kitchen. He kneaded the heavy dough with absolute desperate violence until his forearms ached and the sun finally broke gray over the shipping yards. The back door clicked open at 6:30 a.m. Caleb stepped into the kitchen. He looked completely exhausted, his clothes clean, which meant he had changed out of his work gear at the warehouse before coming home. He stopped dead in the kitchen doorway, his silver eyes taking in the scene. Emerson was standing at the zinc counter, his hands completely white with flour, 24 perfect loaves of rye rising on the wooden boards before him. "I made bread," Emerson said, his voice flat, his chest heaving. "I can see that," Caleb said softly. "I made a catastrophic amount of bread, Caleb." Caleb walked across the kitchen floor, his boots loud on the linoleum. He came up behind Emerson, his large hands settling firmly onto the boy's waist, pulling him back against his chest. He buried his face deep into Emerson's flour-dusted hair, taking a massive, shuddering breath of the boy's scent. The tension left the alpha's frame in visible, physical stages. His shoulders dropped first, then his spine straightened, then his fingers uncurled. His profile settled from the sharp, metallic edge of the docks back into the rich comfort of coffee and cedar wood smoke. "I am so sorry, Emerson," Caleb murmured against his ear. Emerson turned around in his grip, burying his face in the alpha's shoulder. "Don't be sorry. Just be here." "I am here." "Then that has to be enough." The critical conversation took place on a bright Sunday afternoon in May. The spring light was pouring through the east window, and the scent of fresh cinnamon rolls was warm in the apartment. Emerson started it. He set his coffee cup down with a distinct click. "I need to tell you exactly what I require to survive this, Caleb." Caleb paused, his silver eyes fixed on the boy, waiting with absolute, open attention. "I can live with what you do for a living," Emerson said, his voice steady but intense. "I've made that choice consciously. I know who you are. But I cannot live with nights where you simply do not come through the door and I have no idea if you are breathing. I cannot lie in that bed at 3 in the morning wondering if your body is at the bottom of the Puget Sound. It will systematically destroy my mind, Cal. The physical danger isn't the issue. The absolute silence is." Caleb's expression shifted, his brow furrowing. "What do you need?" Caleb asked softly. "Tell me." "Not everything," Emerson clarified. "I don't want the logistical details. I don't want names or transactions. But I need to know when you are going to be late. I need you to give Tyler permission to text me. And you need to understand that when I call that phone and it rings out into silence, every single second of that silence isn't just time passing. It's a machine that drops me right back onto the linoleum floor in Bridger, listening to an alpha tell my father what my body is worth in trade. That is exactly where my psychology goes when I am terrified. You cannot leave me alone in that kitchen." Caleb's face transformed entirely. The iron control slipped away completely, revealing the sudden, crushing realization of an alpha who had spent months applying standard syndicate compartmentalization to his domestic life, believing he was protecting the boy from the dark, never realizing that the silence itself was a weapon. "I didn't see it that way," Caleb whispered, his voice rough. "I kept the ledger separate because I thought the wall was what kept you clean." "The wall doesn't protect me," Emerson said, reaching across the table to grab Caleb's scarred knuckles. "It leaves me completely alone with my worst memories." Caleb pulled the boy out of his chair, drawing him down into his lap, wrapping his massive arms around his frame. "I will do better, Emerson. I swear it to you. I will text you when the shipping lanes run late. Tyler will check in every 3 hours if I'm offline. I will come home to this apartment every single night I am physically capable of walking." "That's all I'm asking for," Emerson murmured against his throat. "It isn't even a fraction of what you deserve," Caleb said fiercely. "It's more than enough. You are enough, Caleb. Stop acting as though you have to be perfectly clean to be worth keeping." "I didn't fall in love with a saint. I fell in love with a man who sat on a dirty bakery floor with me and ate bread at 4 in the morning because it was the only hour quiet enough for both of us to breathe." The months that followed were the finest Emerson had ever known. They weren't perfect, and they certainly weren't easy, but they were fundamentally real. Caleb kept his word with absolute, military precision. If a shipment ran late at the shipping terminals, Emerson received a text 3 hours in advance. Tyler checked in via phone regularly. The lingering shadows of fear didn't completely vanish. The nature of Caleb's empire didn't allow for absolute guarantees, but the anxiety thinned out until it was manageable, nothing more than background noise. In June, Hana Kim began discussing retirement in earnest. She spent 3 hours leaning over the zinc counter, detailing the bakery's financial records, and the look she gave Emerson made it completely clear that the someone she intended to buy the business was him. Ann Voss came west to visit during the second week of June. She was a small, delicate Omega woman with silver threading through her dark hair and the exact same deep, expressive gray eyes as her son. She stood in the front retail space of Lattice at 4 a.m. on a beautiful summer morning, watching Emerson effortlessly pull 20 perfect loaves of artisanal sourdough from the deck ovens and silently wept into a linen napkin. Caleb met her the following evening for dinner upstairs. He arrived wearing a tailored button-down shirt, no leather jacket, carrying a massive bouquet of fresh field flowers he had personally bought at the Pike Place Market. He shook her rough hand with absolute reverence, calling her Mrs. Voss in his low, gravelly baritone. Anne looked at him for a long, silent minute. She tracked the old scar cutting through his left eyebrow, the deep calluses on his heavy knuckles, and the careful, fiercely protective way he positioned his body whenever he stood near her son. Close enough to shield, never close enough to restrict. "You're the alpha who dissolved the debt," Anne said softly, her eyes holding his. Caleb looked over at Emerson, then down at the oak floorboards. I simply adjusted the economic terms, Mrs. Voss. Your son fixed everything else. Anne studied the massive crime lord for another 3 seconds. Then, without a word of warning, she stepped forward, wrapped her small arms around his massive torso, and hugged him with fierce, maternal intensity. When she finally stepped back, Caleb's iron composure cracked in a way Emerson had never witnessed in his entire life. It was a raw, breathless moment of a dangerous man being genuinely wanted by a mother. A biological reality Caleb Vance hadn't experienced since he was 12 years old, back when his own mother had packed a single canvas suitcase and walked out of South Boston, never to return. "Take care of my boy," Anne whispered, her voice thick. "I am," Caleb said, his voice dropping an octave. "I know," she replied, patting his arm. "Keep doing it." The true bond arrived in late August, on a night so suffocatingly warm that every window in the apartment was thrown wide open, letting the distant sapphire sound of the shipping lanes drift up from the harbor. It wasn't planned. Nothing between them had ever been structured by a schedule. They were sitting together on the large sofa, Emerson tucked securely against Caleb's side. The apartment smelled beautifully of fresh basil from the pasta they had shared, mixed with the rich, established profile of cedar smoke and wild honey. Emerson slowly tilted his head back against Caleb's shoulder, completely exposing the long, smooth line of his neck, bearing the sensitive scent gland, the exact coordinate where an alpha's teeth would go. It wasn't a passive invitation. It was an absolute biological statement of ownership. Caleb went completely, utterly still against the cushions. His breathing ceased entirely. "Emerson, do not offer that unless you are absolutely certain. I will not let you take this back. This is permanent. You need to understand what permanent means to a man like me. I have been running from the concept my entire life." "I'm entirely done running, Cal," Emerson said softly, turning his head to look directly into the silver eyes. "I've been certain since the day you sat down in the flower dust with me. I know exactly what it means." Caleb turned his entire massive frame to face him on the sofa. His eyes were bright with a volatile mixture of primal fear, intense want, and the rare guarded hope that belongs only to those who have trained themselves never to expect joy from the world. "I need to tell you one thing first, Emerson," Caleb said, his voice rough, vibrating in the warm room. Emerson waited, his fingers tracing the linen of Caleb's collar. "I left the black leather jacket on the booth on purpose that Friday night," Caleb confessed, his jaw working silently. "I left it because I wanted you to have a physical piece of my scent when I wasn't there to watch the door. I had no idea your body would nest with it. I couldn't have predicted that biology. But my mother left Boston when I was 12. She didn't leave a single scrap behind. Not a scarf, not a coat, nothing that smelled of her skin. I spent 20 years wishing I possessed a single physical object to hold when the house felt too large and the dark came in." Caleb's voice went completely broken, a raw rasp. "And I saw you standing behind that zinc counter every morning. So small, so utterly alone, sleeping on cardboard under 3 layers of toxic chemical blockers. And I thought, he doesn't have a single thing either." Emerson felt a sudden blistering heat behind his eyes. "So I left the jacket," his fingers trembling slightly as he reached up to touch Emerson's jaw, "and Tyler called me at 5 in the morning and told me you were wrapped in it on the velvet sofa, fast asleep, with your scent all the way up. Emerson, I sat in my car in the dark gravel lot behind the warehouse, and I couldn't force air into my lungs for 5 minutes. Because in my entire lethal life, nobody had ever wanted a piece of me enough to hold it while they slept." Emerson's eyes overflowed, 2 hot tears tracking down his cheeks. He reached up, his palms cradling Caleb's rugged face, tracing the sharp jawline, the scar through the brow, the mouth that was always so intensely careful with its words, and so completely reckless with its loyalty. "You absolute, impossible man," Emerson whispered, a half-sob catching in his throat. "You beautiful, impossible man. I've been yours since the moment I picked that leather up. My body understood the math long before my intellect did. It wrapped itself in your cedar and it instantly went to sleep. That was the most honest thing I've ever done in my life." The permanent bond was finalized in that warm, open room, while the lights of the Seattle waterfront blinked below. When Caleb's teeth finally closed gently over the pulsing neck gland, not with the violent force of a predator capturing prey, but with the steady, deliberate pressure of a mate coming home, the two scents permanently fused into a single, unresolvable profile. Wild honey, wet river stone, dark coffee grounds, cold structural steel, deep cedar wood smoke. Together they became the absolute definition of the world, summer rain hitting warm pavement. The physical pain of the bite lasted only a fraction of a second. The warmth, however, was eternal. It flooded instantly from the puncture site down into Emerson's shoulders, through his chest, into his fingertips, and all the way to his boots. He felt Caleb everywhere, a permanent, resonant presence in his very bloodstream that would remain there for the rest of his natural life. He didn't cry out. He produced a single, helpless, profoundly joyful laugh. Caleb pulled his mouth back slowly, his silver eyes fixed on the boy's face. The crime lord mask was entirely gone, shattered into dust. What remained was just a man looking at his mate, his broad shoulders shaking with emotion. They stayed locked together for hours, their foreheads pressed flat, their breaths matching perfectly, learning the physical syntax of a bond settling into the nervous system. There was absolutely no urgency left in the room, only the warm, heavy recognition of two bodies that had been reaching for each other across counters, cold alleys, and dirty floors for months, and could finally, truly rest. The following morning at precisely 4:30 a.m., the brass bell above the front door of Lattice chimed clearly. Emerson Voss was standing behind the zinc counter, his forearms dusted with white flour, a fresh, dark purple bond mark clearly visible just beneath the line of his collar. His natural scent was completely up, transformed in the distinct way a bonded Omega's profile always alters. Richer, deeper, carrying the permanent resonant cedar smoke of his alpha underneath the high summer honey. Caleb Vance walked through the threshold first. "Coffee," he said, his silver eyes locking onto Emerson's face with absolute unvarnished pride. "Black, no sugar." He walked straight to the corner booth and sat down, his leather jacket creaking softly. Tyler stepped in right behind him, followed by Riss and two older alphas from the shipping yards. They took their regular seats. Nobody made a single verbal comment about the mark on Emerson's neck, but Emerson caught Tyler looking directly at the collar that failed to conceal the bite, and the expression on the lean lieutenant's face wasn't surprise. It was absolute, deep satisfaction. The look of a man who had been watching an inevitable chemical reaction for 3 months, and was simply glad the world had finally aligned. Reese caught Emerson's eye from across the zinc counter. The stocky alpha gave him a single, heavy, respectful nod, the total acknowledgement of a mate, then immediately turned his attention back to his morning pastry. The graveyard shift continued exactly as it always had. The bread baked beautifully, the dark coffee poured hot. Nothing had altered, yet every single molecule in the room had fundamentally changed. Emerson stood behind the zinc counter of the bakery that would, by the end of the winter, be legally his. He was permanently bonded to the man who sat in the corner booth. The entire syndicate crew sat in the front room, systematically pretending they saw absolutely nothing out of the ordinary, and Emerson smiled into the flour dust. He had spent his entire life being pleasant, agreeable, and completely invisible just to keep from being broken. Now, standing in the warm, yeasty air of the kitchen, with flour on his hands and an iron bond on his neck, he was for the very first time in his existence wholly and completely himself. He was no longer running, he was no longer a ghost, he was free of the labels that bad men had tried to hammer into his skin: collateral, livestock, good stock, runaway. He was simply Emerson, wanted, kept, worth every single freezing mile of the long, dark road that had finally brought him home.